We're going to click record. Good morning, everybody. Welcome from not the Lehman Center of Beth Shalom, but rather the office, which I believe has a donated, dedicated name, which I should memorize, but I haven't, for the Associate Rabbi, Rabbi Mark Asher Goodman. We are here with Monday Talmud. We've been booted, yea, verily booted, so that the congregation can interview a professional candidate. We could have moved to a bigger space, but it's just me and Cindy and Dee. They're here, they got paper, and Cindy is in the bottom right-hand corner, at least of my screen, which is what will show up on the video, seeing all your shining faces. So Dee, if you miss these faces, there they are. I could have set up a projector, but that would have been a lot of work for. Okay, anyways, we are at the very end of Talmud, Rosh Hashanah, page 33a. We kind of did most of this, but we're gonna kind of go back and do a little chazara, a little review before we take the big moment to flip to 33b. So with that, I will share screen with you. And for those of you in the room, you can start at the top of the first page that we have. So I think Olivia asked about this. So I'll do oh, that's not the page that I want. You want to see the pretty one. There, that's the pretty one. So with that, I will read the Aramaic and turn it over to Noreen, if Noreen does not mind, who I saw last week in Israel, in the flesh. Thanks to Noreen and Marian and Elisheva for hosting me in Carmiel. And special thanks to Elisheva, who wouldn't fit in the car for the driving tour around Carmiel. So I had to bug her off, which is too bad. But we had a nice little tour. I saw the Pittsburgh Promenade. I saw the trees that were planted for the Tree of Life victims, Tree of Life, New Light, Dor Hadash. We went to the park, and my daughter had a really good time playing on all the things. It was a great trip. It was and I didn't tell the Israelis, there was one small hiccup on the way home, which was there was something on the tracks between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, so our train got delayed for about an hour and a half. But we didn't really mind. We were pretty chill. It was not a big deal. We were just hungry. That's all. So that's about it. All right. So the original topic was the question of whether children can blow shofar, and if children can blow shofar, might it count? And if it doesn't count, why could they be allowed to blow in the first place? And that led to the kind of question about women and whether women could blow shofar, and what the reasons were for why children can't blow shofar, and what the reasons were for why women can't blow shofar. Because as we spoke about last time, typically in the Mishnah, the category of women and children, along with slaves typically, are kind of the same, which is they cannot be obligated. Here, this one's probably better for propping. They cannot be obligated in things, and specifically because they cannot be obligated in positive time-bound commandments. And of course, last class, if you'd like to go back and review the videotape, we went deeply into those questions because Rabbeinu Tam does. So now we're going to get out of the question about women and go back to the question that really the Gemara is addressing itself to, which is the question of children. And then the question will continue dealing with the question of, like, it's a really fundamental question, which it's kind of ridiculous that we're almost at the end of Tractate Talmud Rosh Hashanah, and we haven't really dealt with it, which is, what are we doing when we blow the shofar? Like, what notes are we sounding, and what counts and what doesn't? So with no further ado, we're on line 7. Aval mitafsek bahen ad sheyilmedu. Amar Rabbi Elazar, afilu b'Shabbat. Tanya nami hachi, mit askin bahen ad sheyilmedu. Afilu b'Shabbat. Ein ma'agvin hatinokot miltkoa b'Shabbat. Ve'ein tzarich lomar bayom tov. Go ahead.
The Mishnah further states, rather, one occupies himself with them, encouraging and instructing children until they learn how to sound it properly. Rabbi Elazar said this applies even when Rosh Hashanah occurs on Shabbat. This is also taught in a Baraita. One occupies himself with children until they learn to sound the shofar properly, even on Shabbat. and one does not prevent the children from sounding the shofar on Shabbat. And needless to say, one does not prevent them on the festival of Rosh Hashanah that occurs on a weekday.
All right. So there are at least two kind of challenges that come up in this text. But the first thing that we learn is that children can blow on Rosh Hashanah and they can blow on Shabbat, which, as you all probably know, we no longer blow the shofar on Shabbat. That's, by the way, that's going all the way back to the last Mishnah of dealing of all of the issues of why you can or cannot blow shofar on Shabbat. And the answer effectively, as to cut it to the chase, is in Jerusalem and in the land of Israel, they created a procedure by which you could blow shofar on Shabbat, which we no longer do anywhere in the Jewish world. And instead, we have a 2-day Rosh Hashanah, and we blow on the day at which it doesn't fall out on Shabbat. Because I don't know if you all know this, but Shabbat will never be 49 hours long. So we're set. But it does raise, so we have a statement in the Mishnah that unfortunately becomes patently obvious, which is, and it's a kal v'chomer. So if you don't know what a kal v'chomer is, this might be the best place to learn a kal v'chomer in the history of places in the Talmud to learn a kal v'chomer. Okay, if you are permitted to blow shofar on Shabbat, kal v'chomer, you can blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah, which has fewer restrictions. So that kind of paradox, that link there is a classic idea in how a kal v'chomer works, right? If the law is X in this case, then in a lighter case, which is the kal, it would also apply. Now, that all this seems nice and clean and logical. There's one minor problem, which is normally the Talmud would not bother to continue with that final line, right? And so it even remarks on that, right? Afilu b'Shabbat, ein ma'akvin hatinokot milukot b'Shabbat, ve'ein sarich lomar b'yom tov, right? One, needless to say, one does not prevent them on a festival of Rosh Hashanah, which begs the question, why would the Talmud bother to even include those words about Rosh Hashanah if we already basically know that, right? Kal v'chomer, if it's forbidden on Shabbat, then it should be, it's permitted on Shabbat, then it should be permitted on Rosh Hashanah, right? Okay, so let's keep going and see if the Gemara will pull that apart for us. Marion, you're the next window open for me, so you shall read the English. Ha, gufa kasha, amrat, mit askin bahen ad sheyilmedu, afilu beShabbat, alma lahatchila amrinan tiku, v'hadar tanya, ein ma'akvin ikuva hu dela ma'akvin, ha lechatchila lo amrinan tiku.
Gemara asks, this matter itself is difficult. That is, there is an internal contradiction in the Baraita. You said that one occupies himself with the children until they learn how to sound the shofar, and this even applies on Shabbat. Apparently, we say to them, ad initio, sound the shofar. And then the Baraita taught, one does not prevent them from sounding the shofar, which indicates that although one does not prevent them from sounding it, we do not say ab initio, sound it.
Great. Which reminds me, I need to bring my shofar in because Elul's coming up, and I've been warned by folks, Rabbi, you're going to be blowing shofar on Thursday. So I was like, oh, okay, cool. Which is good because the whole point of Elul, in my humble opinion, is this whole section, which is to let the shofar blower for Rosh Hashanah practice, right? That's it. I don't think we blow shofar for any other reason. Other people will disagree.
So
But
the little kids that come from preschool can hear.
Dee thinks it's for the preschool.
It's for the preschool to be terrorized.
It could be that, and
Because they come in and they cry.
But here what we're learning is that the preschool needs to practice. And the whole issue that we're dealing with and practice blowing, not hearing, right? By the way, my daughter started blowing shofar when she was 6. So, and is still probably a pretty good blower. My son never got the hang of it. He's 11 now. So, okay. So the statement here is twofold, and it is somewhat contradictory. So the contradiction that they're going to deal with is not about whether it's Rosh Hashanah and Shabbat, they just move on from that and accept it. The problem that they bring up is a different one. The problem that they bring up is this, right? There's the principle of lahatchila and b'diavad. Lahatchila meaning beforehand, b'diavad meaning after the fact, effectively, right? And so the implication here, and they use the Latin here. The Latin they use is ab initio. Ab initio is lahatchila, like before the fact. So the question is, when a child comes into the synagogue on Shabbat, and let's say it's Elul, and there's a shofar on the table, and they pick up a shofar and blow on Shabbat as practice or for fun. Now, I want to go back and just address a different thing, which is the word mit askin. We talked about this a couple weeks ago. The translation here is as useless as possible. It's one occupies themselves. And this is really, I think, intentional by Steinsaltz, because we don't really know what mitasek means. Mitasek can mean you're blowing the shofar and you're fulfilling the mitzvah. It could mean you're monkeying around with the shofar, right? You're tooting on it, but you're not blowing it. And thirdly, and this is my understanding, this is the way I believe it, mit asek can mean that you're practicing, right? And practice, as Allen Iverson once said in a sports reference about 15 years ago, we talking about practice, meaning practice is not a game, right? When Allen Iverson goes out and tries to score 30 points for the Philadelphia 76ers, it's for realsies, right? No takebacks. But in practice, you're just monkeying around. So mitasek, that's my understanding of mitasek. It's just for practice. The problem is this. If a kid picks up a shofar in synagogue and blows on Shabbat, and the implication is that the phrase here, and we do not prevent them, it means that that's okay. However, if a kid came into my office and picked a shofar up on Shabbat and said, hey, Rabbi, can I practice on the shofar right now? It's unclear whether I, at that point, am supposed to say, absolutely not, you should not do that, or whether I should say, yeah, absolutely, today is a day for practicing blowing the shofar, right? They're very different, and that's lahatchila and b'diavad. Whether you're lahatchila permitted to blow shofar, a tinok, a child, is allowed to blow shofar on Shabbat, or b'diavad, we do not prevent them, meaning they can pick it up and blow it, and we won't give them 39 lashes for doing so, right? Are very different, right? Whether the cop gives me a ticket for rolling through that stop sign or whether I actually stopped at the stop sign is very different, right? Like, because, by the way, that actually happened to me when I first moved to Pittsburgh. There was a stop sign. I kind of rolled through it. There was a cop right behind me. I got pulled over. He let me off. He gave me a warning, right? Which was really nice, but he was basically saying, like, you shouldn't do that, but I'm going to let you go, right? And the difference between actually stopping at a stop sign and getting off when you didn't really stop at the stop sign is very different, right? So that's the case that we're dealing with here. Is a child actually allowed to blow shofar on Shabbat, or are they not prevented, but they really shouldn't do it, right? That's lahatchila and b'diavad. By the way, this is a little complicated because lahatchila and b'diavad are very straightforward concepts. They don't exactly say lahatchila b'diavad here. It's lahatchila and lo ma'akvin, right? Ikuva is the Hebrew, right? It's beforehand you may do it, and however we do not prevent it, which is kind of mixing two different halachic ideas, but that's okay. We're going to let it slide. So the question is, these two different lines have been stated in the Talmud, but we don't have clarity as to which we do. The Talmud will clarify and resolve itself. We have one final line on A, and then we move on to 33B. So with that, I'm going to read 9 just to save us the trouble. Lo kashikan. The Gemara explains this is not difficult. This is not a difficulty. A kasha. Kasha in Hebrew means hard. Lo kasha means it's not a difficulty, meaning we're going to resolve this contradiction post haste. Elisheva, you are going to read this for us. It is 8 words in Aramaic and about 87 in English. Bekatan shehigia lechinuch, kan bekatan shelo higia lechinuch.
In the first clause, the Baraita is dealing with a minor who has reached the age of training in mitzvot. This child is taught to sound the shofar, excuse me, my glasses are dirty, to sound the shofar as one is obligated to teach him the proper way to perform mitzvot. However, here in the second clause, the Baraita is dealing with a minor who has not yet reached the age of training. Although one need not prevent this child from sounding the shofar, one does not encourage him to do so.
Okay, well done. This is a good clarification, but a cheap dodge, in my opinion. And the reason it's a cheap dodge is just because they come up with a rubric, with a structure that says like, oh, you prevent a kid who's a certain age, but you don't prevent a kid who's the other age. The reason I say this is a cheap dodge is they don't explain what it means, a minor who's reached the age of training in mitzvot. Now, this is very personal. I have this problem. My son is a month away from entering into the bell jar of the 1 year period before training for his bar mitzvah. And not only that, but I'm now responsible for the B'nai Mitzvah program at Beth Shalom. Oy gewalt, right? So everything is on me at this. No, just kidding. But the question of like training children in mitzvot is a whole question, right? You don't hypothetically take a kid at the age of 13 and say, today is your birthday, let's put on tefillin for the first time, because hypothetically they should kind of know what they're doing already, right? And the same with Shachrit and Musaf and the other 610 commandments that our religion trains them, right? You don't wake up one morning and suddenly, become obligated in all of them and know them all, right? Hypothetically, there was a training time period before this. So the halachic commentators also mention this. I'll read a little bit of it in Hebrew and do my best to translate it. But I didn't prep this because speaking of preparing children for mitzvot, today is a half day or a less than half day at CDS. I had to drop my kids off, but the drop-off time was 9:30 and the pickup time is 10:30. And clearly I'm teaching, so I had to drop them off early. So as to be the least terrible parent I possibly could, I dropped them off at 9, which meant that I had less time to prepare than I normally would. So anyways, I'll read this to you. If it makes no sense and my Hebrew is terrible, I apologize. So, kan bekatan shehigia v'chulei. Kfar harif me'uvot shtei shitot perush l'halacha. So the Rif, Rabbeinu Alfasi, who is a 9th century Moroccan rabbi, who is the guy who's one of the first dudes trying to figure out what is the actual law as we practice it. So he's the kind of guy who, if a person said, Rabbi, I read this thing on 33b of Rosh Hashanah about preparing your children for mitzvot, when do I start preparing my children for mitzvot? Al-Fasi would say, I have that question too. Here's what I think you should do, right? By the way, it's pretty interesting that it took 4 centuries before people started figuring out what the Talmud meant without actually using the Talmud. Like they created a law code separately. Ukvar danu bahen harishonim, and the Rishonim, the earliest rabbis in the Gaonic period, which starts in like the 500s and goes basically to the 900s, also had to deal with this question. Lishita achad, according to one opinion, katan shehigia lechinuch mitasek imo lilmedu. A child arrives at education and trains themselves in education. V'kol sheken enu ma'akvinoto, and you don't prevent him. Sheharei yesh tzad mitzvah b'davar, for there is an aspect of commandedness in this matter. Ve'ilu katan shelo higia lechinuch kevan she'en b'maasehu mitzvah ein mitaskin behem. And a minor that has not arrived at the age of education does not take part in training themselves in the mitzvah and doesn't practice. Aval kevan she'eno mechayvin b'mitzvot ein ma'akvinoto. Nonetheless, even though they are not obligated in the mitzvot, you do not prevent them. So actually, they don't define the age. They really just kind of stratify this out from going to 2 laws into 4, which is to say, it's asking the question, if a child is not of majority age, are they obligated or are they not obligated? And if they are not obligated, are they prevented? right? And that's basically how they're breaking it up. All right, we'll leave it at that, since we know that the Rif, the Ran, and the other Rishonim aren't actually going to tell us what the age of training for mitzvot is. I suppose they left that up for later rabbis. By the way, a parallel to this that I find interesting, the Talmud has the same issues with eating. There is a rabbi who says that when they ask the question, how long do you wait between meat and milk? One rabbi says you have a brief pause, and another rabbi says meal to meal. And no rabbi in the Talmud has anything about 6 hours or 3 hours or 1 hour. That comes later by later rabbis. So this idea of we don't know when a child is the age by which they should be prepared for mitzvot, same issue kind of appears here. All right, with that, let's get to 33b before we all grow old and can't finish the Talmud. Okay, we did the first line. We're on to Mark. Mark, apparently my Zoom page has organized it Israelis first and then everybody else. So it's the 4 Israelis and then that. So we're on line 2, Rosh Hashanah 33b. I'll do the Aramaic. Hamit asek lo yatsa, hatokeh lashir yatsa, lema Messiah le Rava, de'amar Rava, hatokeh lashir yatsa, dilma tokeh lashir, nami mitasek kare le.
The Mishnah taught one who acts unawares while sounding the shofar without any intention to produce a sound has not fulfilled his obligation. The Gemara infers one who sounds a shofar for music, even if he has no intention to perform the mitzvah, has fulfilled his obligation. The Gemara asks, let us say that the Mishnah supports the opinion of Rava, as Rava said, one who sounds a shofar for music has fulfilled his obligation. The Gemara rejects this suggestion. There is no clear proof from here, as perhaps one who sounds a shofar for music is also called one who acts unawares. It is possible that the Tana of the Mishnah includes in this category anyone who sounds the shofar without a clear intention to fulfill the mitzvah.
Excellent. Okay, so we learn here, Steinsaltz tips his hand and quotes basically Rashi explaining what he thinks mit asek means. So his explanation here at the very top is, by the way, in case you're wondering, like, what does this have to do with the last piece? It doesn't. We've kind of moved on, and that's what the little scroll marker at the left of, for those of you in the room, you don't have it, but maybe you do, actually, I don't know. You may have a little weird character. Yeah, so it's a section. Cindy nailed it. She could teach this class, which is it indicates a new sugya. Now, the idea of a sugya is a new idea in Talmud. It's not actually, the Gemara doesn't actually break itself out into sugyot. We have to intuit that. But here we do have kind of this implication that there's a new section. So the new section is dealing with the question not of children and of women, but now we've moved on to the question of what happens when you pick up a shofar, but you're not trying to fulfill the commandment of letting people hear the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, or hypothetically, I guess, on Elul, in which you're, by the way, not fulfilling a mitzvah. It's just a thing we do, as far as I know. So the word mitasek, as Steinsaltz and Rashi are translating, is while sounding the shofar without any intention to produce a sound. And Rashi says here in his commentary, Ela minvach navuche, which I'm o shehaya nafuch b'shofar v'alta b'yado tekiah. Someone either breathes into it or blows into it. But anyone who knows how to blow a shofar knows that you have to make a seal with your lips and you have to kind of buzz with your lips. Otherwise, no sound, which also, from what I understand, is almost identical to how a brass instrument is played, right? When you blow a shofar,
players are great shofar blowers.
Right. So you don't go like this. When you blow a shofar, you go like this. That's kind of how you blow shofar when you're a shofar blower. The implication that Rashi and Steinsaltz are making is that the person who picks up a shofar and goes is one who acts unaware while sounding the shofar without any intention to produce sound. Now, I don't know, I don't agree, right? I actually think that it's more likely that they're blowing the shofar to go toot, 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 right? But they're not trying to go tekiah, shavarim, teruah, tekiah, okay? So they're making some sounds. The possible understanding that I had is the one that the Gemara comes up with. One who sounds a shofar for music, even if he has no intention to perform the mitzvah, has fulfilled the obligation. So they blow the shofar and they get a sound out of it, but it's not right? It's not the exact notes potentially, which gets us to two things. One who blows a shofar and hears a sound on Rosh Hashanah has fulfilled the mitzvah of hearing the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, even if it's not the notes that the rabbis prescribed and it's not 100 blasts, as we learn the rabbis will prescribe, right? The mitzvah of hearing the shofar is literally hearing tekiah, and then you're done, right? Like you're good. And even if nobody yells tekiah and someone just goes toot, you're done, right? You fulfilled the mitzvah, which is really good. That like it's a minimalist, very straightforward, simple mitzvah. The problem, which we have already experienced about a dozen times throughout this Talmud, is about intent, right? If the intent was for music, right? Miles Davis gets up there and decides he wants to play Few of My Favorite Things, which is actually a John Coltrane song, but that's okay. If he wants to perform all of Bitches Brew on a shofar, okay, I'm allowed to say Bitches Brew because it's the name of a Miles Davis album. Or what's the Blue album? Certain Kind of Blue, I think, something like that, right? If he wants to perform the whole thing on a shofar, first of all, oh my God, how amazing would that be, right? You get like Louis Armstrong in synagogue and he performs an entire, piece on the shofar. You have fulfilled your mitzvah. There's no doubt about it. But they haven't done exactly what you thought, which is, if you turn to Miles Davis and say, hey, play this crazy trumpet for me, man, and he goes wild on it for like a 19-minute solo, it's not exactly the mitzvah of shofar, right? It's something different. And that's a really interesting question. It actually gets at, I see some, Noreen, I'll call on you in a second, and Cindy's laughing at something and I'm sure it's in the chat. So, but a really interesting question becomes, right, like how this applies in all matters, right? If the most beautiful singer in the world is given the English music of a prayer and goes to the Amud and sings this thing with all their heart and soul and might, but they don't really know what they're saying and they're like not particularly interested in it for prayer purposes, but they really want to belt it out. Are they fulfilling the mitzvah? And if they're fulfilling the mitzvah according to this, is it the same if their intent isn't so much in prayer, but more so in song? I think those are analogous here, because what is a shofar if it's not music, right? It's a really weird problem they're bringing up. They're saying one sounds a shofar for music, but doesn't have the intent to perform the mitzvah. How are we going to know the difference between sounding the shofar with the intent for music and sounding the shofar for the intent of the mitzvah? All right, Noreen, ask your question.
Yeah, it's not a question. One year when I was in London, for anybody who's been to London and knows Trafalgar Square, there was a huge event there, and there was a shofar concert. There were about 10 people on the stage, all with different kinds of shofarim, playing the most amazing music. It was. I don't think it wasn't the Klezmer Festival. They have lots of big events in Trafalgar Square, as well as things against Israel. They also have a lot of big happenings to do with the Jewish communities in Israel, and this was amazing. It was first of all, it was amazing to see all these different shofarim, different sizes and lengths and straight and curly, and they gave explanations about them as well. And there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people in the square there watching it, and that was just a point of interest, not a question.
Yeah, no, and I'll just raise two things. For those, we talked about this a couple of months ago, but it's been a while and folks may not have been there, but Cindy, you go next, don't worry. Two things. One is that a shofar, for those of you who don't know how to blow a shofar, you can produce, a decent shofar blower can at least produce two different notes with a shofar, a lower and a higher. when I'm in the right zone, and I've practiced a little bit, I can get 3 notes out of a shofar. They're not like, I can't play a song with those 3 notes because they're not organized in any way, right? There's a great line by U2, all I got is a red guitar, 3 chords and the truth. Most rock songs, if you know 4 chords on the guitar, you can get away with about 20% of all rock and roll music. You're good to go, right?
3 chords is good for almost 90%.
Right. These are not the right 3 chords, though. These are not the right 3 notes. They won't get you anything. So, but a good musician, as far as I know, can produce at least 4 notes on the shofar. A really talented trumpet or bugle player can produce 4 notes, which is why, to Noreen's point, you can have a concert with shofars. I don't know how great it would be, and Noreen can testify as to how good that was. So the other thing I was going to say was, right before I left Jerusalem, I stopped by.
It was interesting.
It was
interesting. Okay.
Noreen, would you prefer to hear a concert of 12 shofar blowers or a dragoon full of bagpipe players? What's more melodic?
I don't like bagpipes.
I love bagpipes.
I know there are lots of people who do, but I don't. So it's a sort of moot point.
Wow, Noreen, Scottish, doesn't like bagpipes.
Yeah.
Ellie
I don't
Sheva,
like-
not Scottish, does like bagpipes. It's childhood trauma, Noreen. You probably were exposed to too many bagpipes as a child. The other thing I was going to say was I had the opportunity to stop by a really great Judaica store in Rehavia in Jerusalem called Chavruta. I picked up a whole bunch of books there. My daughter got stickers, so she was happy. By the way, I do have a son, and I spent time with him in Israel too, but we kind of like divided and conquered a little bit, and my son and my wife spent more time together. But anyways, and they had they had a huge section of shofarot, and they had them laid out by price. And it was a great instruction. This class, I should have taken a picture. This class would have loved it because there were cheap, simple, really basic shofarot for about 80 shekel, which is like $20 basically. And then there was a pile of 300 shekel shofarot. There were 150 shekel shofarot. There were 300 shekel shofarot, which were a little bit bigger and a little bit nicer. The really big Ruff's ram's horn, I think mountain goat horns were the most expensive. They were like $300. They were like 800 shekels, so like 270. And then up above, the kudu horns, the really long ones, which I would have assumed would have been the most expensive, were actually cheaper than the really thick, big ram's horns. Those were only about $200. So yeah, my shofar would have been priced roughly in the $80 bin. And I thought to myself, like, ooh, I should buy a nice fancy new shofar. And then I went, Dumkov, you've dropped like $200 on books and you just bought some sandals, and don't buy another shofar. You've got a shofar, it works fine. And there's also like 3 at my synagogue in Erie that just sit in a case gathering rust all day long. Rust? Dust. If I wanted another shofar, I could take it. All right, Cindy, go ahead, ask your question.
So I'm actually going back to what you were talking about intentionality in prayer.
Can't hear you, Cindy.
I can hardly hear you.
Oh, well, you're hearing me through Rabbi. You're going to hear me. I'm going to hear. They're going to hear me. I'm not going to.
Oh, are you muted on there?
I'm muted.
Good. So
Okay. So just. Oh, look! Now I'm in 2 places at the same time. How good is that? So I was thinking about what you said about the non-Jew or somebody who does not understand the prayer, who gets up in front of the congregation and sings it beautifully, right?
Mm.
And the idea of intentionality, if you don't know what you're saying, is it effective or not effective in some way? And it got me thinking about times in my Jewish life where we hired a non-Jew to be the cantor, say, for the high holidays.
Wow.
Because Reform synagogue, and like anybody who can sing it, that's good enough, isn't it? And actually in my conservative synagogue as a kid, we used to have a professional choir that would come in and sing. but they were not, some of them at least were not Jewish.
Right.
And I always wondered about that. Like, how can you have, non-Jews like chanting these prayers that they're just basically singing the syllables?
Right.
And it sounds very beautiful to the person who knows what it is, but is it really effective?
Right.
So how do we deal with that?
The simple answer is, as long as one person is singing it or leading it who is Jewish, they are fulfilling the obligation. Now, the really challenging, interesting thing in Talmud is that in Jewish law is that one of the issues that the Talmud and Brachot deals with is that if you have a multiplicity of people leading or chanting, right? And by the way, this actually applies to a very sticky one in the conservative movement, which is two people getting an aliyah to the Torah on Shabbat. If both people say, Baruch Hu et Adonai Hamvorach, there's an idea that you cannot hear serially. In fact, we came upon this back 10 pages ago in the Gemara here, which with the question of a shofar that is being blown into a cave or a cistern. And the question of, are you hearing the shofar or are you hearing the echo of the shofar? And if you're hearing both at the same time, how could you distinguish between the two? And therefore, would you be fulfilling the mitzvah? The same issue applies with two people going up to recite a bracha at the same time, and would also apply even more so if you had a choir of 8. So hypothetically, and this is going to sound weird, one might make the argument, the ideal choir would have 1 Jew and 7 non-Jews.
Wow.
Because the 7 non-Jews that you were hearing wouldn't count, but the Jew you would hear now would count. Now, by the way, we don't really do this. And by the way, we do in the conservative movement, we've made an exception for this, partially because the Talmud doesn't resolve itself extremely clearly and say you absolutely can't serially hear Devar Shebik Dusha. You can't serially hear obligated lines in the text. There is a debate as to whether it's permissible or not. And so because it's not clear, the rabbis of the conservative movement went back and said, we'll allow it, right? I've asked here at Beth Shalom, I've noticed that at Beth Shalom, generally, we don't have more than 2 people go up for an aliyah. Rabbi Adelson told me as Maradatra that there's nothing actually against larger group aliyot, but we don't do it anyways, which is interesting to say.
Or
But
maybe you only have one person actually chanting.
Simchat Torah, they call a group of.
yeah, and the reason, right, Dee remembers that at Simchat Torah we do large groups. There's another way to do that, which is pretty wild in some synagogues, which is you take out as many Torahs as you possibly can, and you have everybody in the community get an aliyah one by one, and you have like 7 or 8 Torahs around the room, and you let everyone bless and read and bless and read and bless and read.
Yeah, that's been done here too.
Cindy says
Yeah,
that's interesting.
Or it has been in the past.
I
Yeah.
haven't seen.
Probably before Rabbi Adelson.
No, actually, I think it was the first year he was here.
Right. The problem still exists, though, which is can multiplicities of individuals say something out loud and fulfill a commandment in which the listener can't necessarily hear and pick out one sound, whether that's shofar or whether that's. So here we also have the greater problem of like trying to derive intent from the shofar blower. Did the shofar blower get up there to be Miles Davis? Or did the shofar blower get up there to fulfill our obligation? And if they are Miles Davis and they didn't mean to fulfill our obligation, but we're listening to them with the intent of having our obligation fulfilled, how can we say that it wasn't, right? Right? If I blow shofar at in Erie and everyone hears it, and then I finish and I just look at the congregation, I go, just kidding, I was just warming up. Let me do that for real now. Right? But everyone was in their spiritual moment and they were listening to it. What the heck, man? Like, is that a thing? All right. Cindy, do you still have your hand up?
No.
Great. Marion, go ahead. I got it.
Okay, I just wanted to say there was a time in our congregation where we used to have a lot of Tosafot, a lot of extra aliyot, breaking up like the 7th aliyah or the 6th aliyah into a couple of parts. But it really got too long, and that's when we started having couples or sometimes 3 to do an aliyah, to do the brachot. because it was preferable. And Simchat Torah, you need enough people who are able to read Torah to do that.
Yep, absolutely. So trying to deal with the practicalities of the synagogue are really an important thing. And the reason why we have these large group aliyot at medium-sized synagogues and small synagogues, it's so that you can get all of the B'nai Mitzvah family up there. In a really big synagogue, like which sometimes ours feels like on a given moment, you have to have multiple aliyot, like group aliyot, because there's a baby naming and there's a B'nai Mitzvah and there's a 50th wedding anniversary. And all those things. Additionally, one last thing, which is in the egalitarian era, it also matters, right? If you go to an Orthodox synagogue and the B'nai Mitzvah's father and uncle and brother all get aliyot, you don't have to worry about the mother and the sister and the daughter all getting aliyot also, right? But here, to say, oh, we only want one person to do the aliyah and we're going to pick the man or we're going to pick the woman would be difficult, right? So that's why that's to some degree, egalitarianism sort of created the need for group aliyot. And I'm okay with that. I mean, I think that's actually a good thing. Equality causing a need for halachic innovation is a good problem to have. Go ahead, Elisheva.
Agreed.
And at one point, we used to have, usually the parents of the bar bat mitzvah would come for a joint aliyah, or there were other occasions. And what we decided to do is 2 or 3 people might be called up for the honor of the aliyah, but only one read the blessing.
Great. Yeah, that's one way to do it. It feels nice, but it avoids any halachic problem. If your Mara D'Atra has a halachic problem, which in my experience here in the conservative movement in the United States, I have met very few who say you can't do that. Right? Okay.
Our rabbi didn't have a problem with it, but our ritual director was stricter than strict. So he had a problem with it. And for some things, we let him rule, and others we didn't.
I've been informed that was an issue here at Beth Shalom too, that the cantor and the rabbi didn't always agree. I have that problem by the way, I have that problem in Erie. In Erie, they hire an Orthodox cantor who comes in, and I sometimes lay out like, oh, here's what we're doing. And sometimes he ignores me. And I don't like it. Okay.
Our ritual director was not ordained clergy of any kind. He was just very knowledgeable, and he was our Baal Koreh. But he had opinions. Yeah. And he could be difficult at times. He was wonderful in other ways.
My cantor in Erie, also not an ordained cantor. My cantor in Erie and I also don't quite see eye to eye on many things. But there's nothing older in the universe than a cantor and a rabbi that do not quite get along very well. If you meet a cantor and rabbi pair that are like best of friends and they get along great, call me. I'd love to see that. I've never seen it.
Oh, we had that.
Ooh,
we had that
great.
For many years. Rabbi Schwartz and Cantor Shames were absolutely like that. It was never a problem. The problem was the ritual director.
Yeah. All right, onward. Let's finish this sugya because it's actually a really short one, which is it actually Steinsaltz throws in another scroll, which that's in this English version. In the Hebrew version, the sugya actually continues down to Nami Mitasek, which is the next 2 lines. So hopefully we'll finish that. We have 5 minutes. With that, we're going to go to a non-Israeli. Renee Rama, will you do the English for us of line 3? V'hashomea min hamitasek lo yatsa, aval hashomea min hamashmia la'atzmo mai yatsa. Lema tehivei tiyuvte de Rabbi Zera, de Amar le Rabbi Zera le Shama'e ik vein utaka li.
The Mishnah continues, and one who hears the shofar's blasts from one who acts unawares has not fulfilled his obligation. The Gemara asks, however, one who hears the shofar's blast from one who is sounding the shofar for himself without intention of sounding it for others, what is the halacha? The Mishnah apparently indicates that he has fulfilled his obligation. Let us say that this is a conclusive refutation of the opinion of Rabbi Zera. As Rabbi Zera said to his attendant, have the intention to sound the shofar on my behalf and sound it for me. This statement indicates that one must have the intention to enable the one who hears it to fulfill his obligation.
Great. So the Talmud introduces two possible cases and then clarifies that the statement of the Mishnah, the second statement of the Mishnah, is a refutation of a baraita by Rabbi Zera that implies that Rabbi Zera did it a certain way. The Mishnah then is brought here to basically say, but Rabbi Zera was wrong and you can't do this anymore, which is an interesting kind of punch. So the two cases that are brought up are the Miles Davis case, right? Miles Davis picks up the shofar, he blows bitches brew on the shofar. By the way, you know that I love saying bitches brew in a Talmud class and getting away with it because it's the proper name. He blows bitches brew on the shofar. He puts it down. And he says, thank you, everybody. I'll be, at the Blue Note on Tuesday, right? That person has not fulfilled your obligation, nor their own obligation, because they did not intend to blow the shofar with the intent to blow shofar to fulfill the obligation. Now, what about me? Let's say I pick up the shofar on Rosh Hashanah in my bedroom, and I didn't go to shul that day, and I'm like, I'll blow the shofar and fulfill the obligation for myself with the window open. And my neighbor next door, who also didn't go to synagogue that day, hears the shofar being blown and goes, my neighbor's blowing shofar. I have fulfilled my obligation to hear shofar on Rosh Hashanah. The critical question there is, so clearly I have fulfilled the commandment for myself, for I had the intent to blow for myself. Can my neighbor Joe, my neighbor actually is named Joe, can my neighbor Joe say that he fulfilled the obligation for himself? The Mishnah apparently indicates that he has fulfilled his obligation, right? So Joe has fulfilled it, which is logical, because how could my neighbor know that I didn't intend for him to hear and fulfill the obligation for the shofar? So it's kind of a logical, to me, it's very logical, mostly just in the sense that like we can't really discern. And that is a rejection of the way that Rabbi Zera threw it out there, which is Rabbi Zera handed to his servant, we assume here is Jewish, have the intention to sound the shofar on my behalf and sound it for me. And the implication here is, no, Rabbi Zera, you cannot do that. You either have to blow it for yourself, or you have to have the attendant say, I am blowing it for everyone. You can't have the attendant blow it for you and not for himself, right? Which is already a bizarre thing, right? D's going to blow shofar. It won't count for D, but it will count for Cindy. That makes like no sense, but Rabbi Zera said it anyways, as if it were a possibility. So we have all these permutations, right? One who blows for everyone, the most obvious. One who blows just for himself. Parenthesis, you can't really do that. Anyone who hears it fulfills the obligation. And one who blows not for themselves, but for everyone else, parenthesis, you also can't do that. That's the case of Rabbi Zera. All right, so we have a really interesting conclusion. This line is the conclusion of the sugya, so I know we only have 15 technical seconds left of class, but we'll read it anyways. And Paula, do you mind reading for us? So we're on line 4 for those of you who are in the room. Dilma ad ide de Tana Resha mit asek, Tana Seifa nami mit asek.
The Gemara rejects this argument. Perhaps one can explain that since the first clause of the Mishnah taught the halacha with regard to one who acts unawares, the latter clause also taught the halacha with regard to one who acts unawares. If so, no inference may be drawn from here to the case of one who sounds the shofar for himself with no intention of doing it so for others.
Okay, so the Talmud kind of goes back and says, all right, well, maybe the case of Rabbi Zera isn't fully rejected, since the Mishnah implies to one who acts unawares the latter might also apply to one who acts unaware. So we're left here in the Talmud basically tried to end one line up with clarity, right? Saying the blower has to have intent and the hearer doesn't really have to have intent. But the Talmud then kind of goes backwards at this final line and implies something that we already know from about 10 pages earlier, which is you might have actually fulfilled your obligation even if you heard unawares, which is kind of crazy, but they're throwing out the possibility here that one who sounds for themselves may fulfill the obligation for another person, even if, the one who does not sound, the case of Rebbe Zera might actually be okay, which is that a person who hands a shofar to another person and says, you may fulfill it for me, but not for yourself, may actually be fulfilling the obligation. They've done a thing here, which is pretty nasty, which is they've shlugged up the kasha, which is another way of saying to slug up a kasha is to say, we have a line above, it's not really a kasha. We have actually, we've slugged up the teirutz would be the technical way of applying it. A teirutz is a response. We had up above a sort of clean understanding of what to do, and the Gemara muddies the waters and makes it less clear. And they also use the phrases, the Resha and the Seifa. They're referring to probably the Mishnah and the statement of Rebbe Zera, but we're not entirely sure. They actually might have been referring to the two different possible permutations of the Mishnah. We're left in a state of uncertainty. We end and we move on, right? Which is classic Talmud, right? Rather than end on clear resolution, we'd like to leave in a case where what we really want to do halachically is end in a case where what we're really trying to do is say both the blower and the hearer ought to have presence of mind when they do the act, right? And that's really the most important thing. The Talmud is always going to be dealing with cases where we're unsure as to whether we're dealing with a case that is certain or uncertain. We want to have clarity. We want to make sure that both the hearer and the blower have presence of mind. But in a case in which the hearer or the blower do not have presence of mind, the Talmud still wants to kind of bring in the possibility that you may have fulfilled your obligation. All right, that's all the time we have for today. We're gonna call it a day on our class. And I really appreciate everyone being here today. Thanks, everybody.
We appreciate your being back.
Thank you.
Same
Oh,
here.
I am very glad.